Bleach has for a long time been one of my favorite anime of all time, to put it quite frank. I mean, it had pretty much everything that I wanted on arrival. There was cool fights, iconic transformations, super iconic transformations, cool drip, and what I would consider the coolest main character out of all of the big three in Ichigo Kurosaki, if we're just calling a spade a spade. Bleach has often, though, been referred to as the weakest story of the big three in terms of overall storytelling and when it comes to character writing. However, I think this is usually due to a fundamental misunderstanding of what is being presented to us as the audience. So in today's video, I want to dive into this misunderstanding by exploring Ichigo's journey throughout the story, right up until he becomes a true Soul Reaper, and then explore why this misunderstanding may have happened in the first place. So with all the preamble out of the way, I do want to say thank you guys so much for the support that you've been showing. Please continue liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really does help the channel. I again do read and respond to every single comment, but now let's get it done.
Kurosaki Ichigo, Shinigami Taiko da.
Ichigo's journey to becoming a true Soul Reaper is honestly a very subtle one throughout the story. For majority of the story, he doesn't know anything of his true lineage till 80% or 90% into the manga. And, he believes, again, for majority of the story, that he's just a regular human who gained the abilities of a Soul Reaper due to absorbing what he thought was all of Rukia's powers at the time. And if we follow this logic, then there should be a cap to how powerful Ichigo can become throughout the story. It should only be as strong as Rukia was, or if you want to be generous, has the potential to become. And this is in no way am I knocking Rukia and her abilities, because if you've watched up to or read the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, you know that Rukia's Bankai and her powers, they're kind of cracked, right? But as the story progresses, however, we see time and time again that even after Rukia does regain her Soul Reaper abilities, Ichigo has far eclipsed her in terms of powers. By the end of the Soul Society arc, Ichigo has properly surpassed her by achieving what we thought at the time was a Bankai, or his true Bankai. And that is actually commented on by Byakuya Kuchiki, where he states that that is not a Bankai, which at the time we all kind of dismissed and thought was just him being dismissive of Ichigo's talent and kind of hating on him, right? Because he achieved what takes Captain level Shinigami, or close to Captain level Shinigami, 10 years to do in the span of 3 days. And yes, Yoruichi was helping him, and she was using Kisuke's super experimental hyper training method kind of thing, right? But it wasn't his real Bankai. And we would come to later find out that this is just his Quincy powers manifesting to suppress his true Soul Reaper and Hollow powers. And this was our first real hint at the subtle storytelling and foreshadowing that Tite Kubo uses throughout the story of Bleach, which is one of the reasons I believe people have been so critical of Bleach in terms of the story. You aren't being info dumped on throughout the story the same way that other anime do. It happens seamlessly throughout character dialogue that we as the viewer may dismiss, because we're in the same shoes as Ichigo. So these little gaps that are being filled in, he doesn't take it as anything important, right? Because again, the guy that you're fighting just told you, hey man, that shit you got right there is not a Bankai. So I'm gonna be like, oh, you hating? Yeah, I got a power up off this bitch. You're just hating on me. But next is his hollow / Soul Reaper powers, which are pretty much intertwined off the bat, because Soul Reapers and Hollows are related by being two sides of the same coin. The reason for this is because they originate from the same beings and the same source, that being the souls of humans, because at one point Soul Reapers were humans, at one point Hollows were humans that lost their heart after becoming after dying, that kind of thing, right? You know how it goes. You've watched Bleach, right? And this is why they evolve so similarly throughout the story. Soul Reapers getting Shikai and Bankai, and the Arrancar, the Espada, being able to become Arrancars, first of all, and then having their release form and then their resurrection form in the case of Ulquiorra, right? So things like that. And off rip, Ichigo is given a very negative view of Hollows. So when he manifests his own Hollow powers, he tries his best to suppress it or outright reject it. Because when he meets White in his inner world, he believes him to be somewhat of an inner demon who is out to take control of his body, right? He doesn't see him for what he truly is. And whenever he encounters this part of himself, it's more about control than it is acceptance. He only sees it as a tool to use, which is represented by the mask he puts on when he accesses his Soul Reaper / Shinigami powers. He puts it on as a tool. Ichigo has a fundamental misunderstanding of what is going on within himself for majority of the story. He sees this power as some outside force to be tamed, right? He doesn't see it as part of himself. And after having his Bankai broken at the beginning of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc by Yhwach, Ichigo is forced to confront all the sides of himself to not only reforge his blade, but to forge his true blade, right? And he once again goes into his inner world to discuss with Old Man Zangetsu, which we all know is just really young Yhwach, right? Who he finally realizes is just, again, a younger version of Yhwach. He tells the truth that he isn't his Shinigami powers, but his Quincy powers that he inherited from his mother, and White was his true Soul Reaper / Shinigami powers the whole time. And the thing is that his Quincy powers weren't necessarily doing this out of malicious intent. He only wanted to protect Ichigo from the path of becoming a Soul Reaper, viewing it as a destructive path, trying to save him from what eventually, him having to face the real Yhwach later down the line, because I guess he kind of always knew that he would come back, that kind of thing, right? Along with the fact that it just didn't trust White, because I'm not sure if you know, but Quincy's can't metabolize hollow DNA the same way that Soul Reapers can, because they're not from the same source. Like, they're two completely kind of different things, right? And the forming of the two Zangetsus, and I put two in quotations, shows Ichigo's full acceptance of who he is and where he comes from. And again, I use the term two loosely because while they are separate during his Shikai, once he activates his Bankai, they become one. They are the same. And one acting as the sheath and the other acting as the blade, which, if you have been paying attention, makes sense because one aspect of himself covered the other, but this time it's being done in harmony. And if I need to spell it out a little bit more for you, the sheath is the Quincy powers and the blade is the Soul Reaper powers.
ありがとう、残月。あんたは俺だ。
The main reason as to why some themes in Bleach are so heavily misunderstood is largely due to the fact of, as I stated before, they aren't exactly heavy-handedly thrown at you the same way they are in other stories. Until it comes time in the story for them to be explored or developed, they're just breadcrumbed, sprinkled throughout in character dialogue or maybe something in the background and things like that. Because out of the big three, I would say that Bleach has the most nuance when it comes to its story. Because while I think that One Piece does nuance very well throughout its very long tenure, love you, One Piece, there will always end up being a right or wrong person by the end of the story. Naruto even more so than the other two, which is why I believe it was so, commercially viable and the most commercially successful immediately upon release. The story does not ask you to think as much as others, and this isn't me saying by any means that Bleach is some groundbreaking form of storytelling and Kubo's developing this new way of doing things. But it does ask its readers to pay attention to the finer details more than others. The relationship between Byakuya and Rukia at the beginning of the story was a fine example because it was tested heavily during the Soul Society arc. Byakuya truly did love Rukia, or does love Rukia, as his younger sister, but he was torn between his love for her and his duty as both a captain and the head of the Kuchiki clan. It's very funny, I said Kuchi clan in one of these takes, but it's the head of the Kuchiki clan. And also his love for her sister, because her sister, Rukia's older sister, made Byakuya promise to adopt Rukia into the Kuchiki clan, right? And the most subtle form of storytelling by Kubo, I believe, can be found with the idea of Kenpachi, not the character, but the title in general, because Zaraki adopts the name before joining the 13 Court Guard squad, where he would go on to kill the 10th Kenpachi and formally adopt the name, becoming the 11th Kenpachi, right? And for the longest time, if you didn't really pay attention to the story, you would think that he was the only Kenpachi in the story. Unohana, on the other hand, however, is revealed to have been the first Kenpachi ever, which if you look back at her appearances throughout the story, it makes sense. She is always highly spoken about by Shunsui, who is one of the most powerful captains in the story. Let's just put that out there. Even beyond her just being a captain, there's also the fact that she's one of the founding members of the 13 Court Guard Squad, having founded the 11th Division that Zaraki would then come to lead. And even long after she has left it, this squad still treats her with the same respect and reverence that they do for Zaraki, which you could, typically attribute to the fact that she is also a captain, but they don't do this for any other captain throughout the series. There's also Aizen and his outright refusal to engage with her during the battle in the Fate Katakura Town arc, or at any point throughout the story. Aizen does not want to smoke with Unohana because he's just like, yep, nope, she got it. Which, if you know anything about Aizen, it's always calculated. He was willing to fight any of the other captains, or in the case of Yamato, knowing that he couldn't release his Bankai in the real world, he prepped for him with Wonder Weiss. With Unohana, he truly feared her and didn't think he could defeat her in any way, shape, or form because, one, how bloodthirsty she is, how powerful she was, and her healing. She developed that so she could keep fighting. She learned and became one of the best healers in the Soul Society to continue fighting, because then she's like, oh, the only way to not be able to keep fighting is if I'm too damaged. And if I heal myself, I'm not too damaged. Unohana is a dog. I'm not making this an Unohana video, but genuinely, Unohana is a dog, and I do love her character, right? And I'm not saying Kubo's storytelling strategy is some groundbreaking form of storytelling, but the breadcrumbs are often missed by the average reader who read or watch Bleach, which unfortunately does lead Bleach to becoming the most misunderstood story of the big three, especially with his characters. People always look at Ichigo and say like, oh, he's kind of a boring character, he doesn't really do much, he just gets more powerful, he doesn't really go through any development. But if you look at Bleach and you look at what's going on, and you look at the little breadcrumbs, there's development there. I'm not saying it's huge, but it's there. And during the early 2000s, Bleach was one of the biggest anime in the world. It introduced many of us to our first real look at anime, and as time went on though, it somewhat fell to the wayside after the anime went on hiatus, and with a not so satisfying end to an otherwise great manga, because they kind of did Kubo really bad. They did him really wrong by just giving him like 5 chapters, wrap shit up. It seemed like the story would never get the chance to properly end. But with the 1,000-Year Blood War arc coming back, its reemergence has brought back interest into the franchise, and it finally answers those lingering questions that the anime onlys had for the longest time. Because I don't know if you know, you probably do, but in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, we are getting added content in there, which I love, and I truly hope that they adopt the Can't Fear Your Own World stuff. I really do hope they do this. I truly hope that with this, the misunderstanding of a large part of the story will be cleared up, again, especially with these added content, right? But that's the video, and as usual, if you made it this far into the video, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't think you would if you made it this far, but please consider liking, subscribing, and let me know down below in the comments your opinion on Ichigo's journey, or just how you feel about Bleach and its story in general. Maybe I'm wrong and Ichigo's not some complex character and Kubo's writing sucks. Just let me know all that stuff. But that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I love you. Good.